Hey, thanks for tuning in. This is the Crescive method. I'm Scott, and this is my wife, Sarah. We provide data and analytics for all types of farming, and I would say that we've done more biological assessment of cannabis soils than anybody else on the planet. And today we're going to try and share a little bit of information with you of what we've learned along the way.
I would say this information applies across the board, not just cannabis. This is just science, the science of the soil food web, and the thought processes of humans that affect that.
Which is a very good point.
Yes.
The reason why I mentioned cannabis is we get 4 harvests in a calendar year, which gives us a tremendous opportunity to get many repetitions in a calendar year. So today we're going to try and make a picture image of what happens with the biological systems in the soil as we engage in the farming processes. So here we've got a little graph here. We've got our biology along this side, and we've got time over here. And then there is a delineation line between good and bad results, and we would call that the aerobic or the biocomplete or biologically complete zone, which simply means that the biological populations and ratios in the soil are ideal for higher level obligate aerobe plants. Below that line would be decreased oxygen or anaerobic zone, which is typically in higher level aerobic plants is where we see the pest and disease. And on our biological assessment sheet, we've color coded those boxes to blue, meaning very good populations, well into the biologically complete zone. The green box would be within the biological minimums as set by Dr. Elaine Ingham. Orange would be just below those biological minimums.
Caution.
And red would be either significantly below those biological minimums or into a dangerous zone where we often see pretty good pest and disease pressure. So
You can be, just for clarification, I know that on this chart we're talking about aerobic and biocomplete in one lump, but you can be aerobic and not be biocomplete. But the two go hand in hand as far as you cannot be biocomplete without it being aerobic.
which is a really good point.
Yes.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
So above the line, we've got the desirable goal for higher level aerobic plants. Below that line might be more suitable for like pond plants or some sort of water plant. But for the most part, in agriculture, we are cultivating what we would call obligate aerobe plants, which require an oxygen-rich environment with which to survive. So an important component of this living soil biologically complete farming is the inoculation aspect. Do you want to describe the inoculation aspect, Sarah?
Yeah, so for the purposes of this graph, we're talking about a biocomplete inoculation. So that really expensive compost that we call biocomplete is the inoculation event that we're talking about. A lot of people, they'll use packaged bacteria, EM1, things like that. Those are technically inoculation events, but for the purposes of this graph, we are talking about biocomplete compost. So that means all of the organisms in the soil food web that, we think we're about to do really good. We've got this biocomplete compost, right? We should be able to establish these organisms. So just follow along with us on this timeline here.
So we've got our inoculation event, which you would hope would bring you up into those ranges where you start to be into the biological minimums. So we have our compost extract treatment. We've now seen an increase in soil organisms, hopefully getting you into those biological minimums. And ideally, our fertilization strategy, our farming behaviors, and our environment would be conducive to a slow, progressive increase in those biological organisms that you inoculated, because they should just go on their own, shouldn't, generally speaking?
Yeah, if we're doing good cultivation techniques, and typically that means we're measuring to know whether or not our techniques and our fertilization or nutrition strategies are actually feeding the soil biology and they're establishing, that would be the trajectory that we would normally see, is a slow, steady increase. Obviously, the more you till, the more that hinders that, but this should be the trajectory if everything that we're doing is actually conducive to our organisms establishing. Making
Right.
sure they have enough food, making sure they have enough water but not too much, all those things. This is that trajectory.
So applying appropriate amounts of stimulating products like fulvic acid, humic acid, Provita, Kelpzyme, basically choosing our fertilization strategy that supports the increase of this biology as we move through time. Conversely, what most farmers do, if they inoculate with a biologically complete compost to begin with, but
Right.
let's say let's say we're starting off with the proper compost to execute this activity. We have a successful inoculation. We see an upward trend moving into the biological minimum zone, and but we're also compelled and compulsed and told that we should be using integrated pest management products, spraying our plants in an effort to control pest and disease. As soon as you do this, there's often a radical drop in soil organisms, whether you inoculated with a biologically complete compost or not. We've done side-by-side studies, and like I said, we've tracked more cannabis soils than anybody on the planet, and we have had example after example after example after example following this same exact pattern. In one particular farm we tracked, they had 2 greenhouses, and one of those greenhouses they sprayed with a very light, very moderate, standard recipe from the internet on neem oil, and the other greenhouse they did not. Through that one single light application of less than 2 gallons per 1,000 square feet of a moderate neem oil spray caused an 82% reduction in soil organisms, which at the end of the harvest led to a 23% reduction in yield from one single spray, y'all. One single spray at the wrong time in the life cycle. 82% reduction in organisms, 23% reduction in yield. So we don't typically think about our IPM spray having effects on productivity.
Especially when they're organic and we think they're natural.
Yeah, but-
and they are, but they're often very effective. Those terpenes can be used to kill things, which often happens in trees. And, when we're shredding up trees, those, the eucalyptus and the pine and those kinds of things that we smell, that terpene profile of that particular plant is actually very antimicrobial. That's why we use cedar. You know what I mean, for our closets and things like that. So they're very effective. And so just be aware that just because it's organic, and that's great that we're trying to use something organic, doesn't mean that it won't actually harm biology. Oftentimes it does.
Usually does.
Yeah.
And so in this situation, we have a proper inoculation. We see a climbing in biological organisms leading into this green stripe, which is the biological minimums. We make our standard industry prescribed IPM spray, causes up to an 80% reduction in organisms, and then now we're starting to roll around in the land of the thrips. And pretty consistently in our work, we see this orange stripe here below the biological minimums, but not necessarily anaerobic, so not driving pest and disease pressure from reduced oxygen conditions, but definitely below this green stripe, which is the biological minimums that is needed to support the plant in question.
And that can be supporting the plant in just the nutrient cycling alone. So oftentimes those are the first things that you kill are the nutrient cyclers. So all of our protozoans, all of our nematodes, things like that are actually cycling all of the food that you put in, the organic matter, and feeding it to your plants. And so that's the biggest damage that we see is that killing effect to that category. But we can also have a very pronounced killing effect to the fungi, which then starts to push us into that anaerobic zone even further. But
Yeah, so maybe explain what nutrient cycling means.
so the nutrient cycling is done by the second level of organisms that then eats the base level of organisms. So the first level of organisms that build the soil food web and all of life is the fungi and the bacteria. So they're sequestering nutrients into their bodies. They're mining the sand, silts, and clay, and they're pulling up all of these nutrients and creating a symbiotic relationship with the roots of your plants. And so the plant is feeding the microbes, the bacteria, and the fungi and bacteria are then thus also going out and getting what that plant needs and feeding it back to the plant. And so that's the first step of acquiring the nutrition into their bodies. And then you have the big fish eating the little fish, that phenomenon, which is the next level of organisms. Those are your nutrient cyclers. That's what we refer to them as. So that's your protozoans, your beneficial protozoans, flagellates, amoebas, and also your beneficial nematodes. They're cycling nutrients in an aerobic zone, and that means that they are eating the bacteria and the fungi and taking what they need for themselves and releasing all of the extra as bioavailable forms for your plant.
Right.
So that's what we mean by nutrients.
So as one thing eats another thing, nutrients are produced.
That's right.
That's
Yep.
pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But in order
Pretty
for that to
ingenious.
happen, we need things eating other things.
That's right. We need them there.
All right. So just to recap here now. So we've started with a proper inoculation of biologically complete compost. We've moved into the biological minimums, which should lead to desirable plant growth and positive health. But again, we've made our IPM spray, which causes up to an 80% reduction in organisms. And yeah, Migs, you're right. Damn. Oh man, that's so small. I don't know why this
We'll
thing
get there.
changes.
1 second.
Well, we'll get this right. Let me try this again. There we go. And just like Migs is saying, damn. Yeah, exactly, right? Okay, so we've measured up to an 80% reduction in organisms with one moderate spray.
Yeah.
Well, now you're existing in this below the biological minimums, which on a simple sense means that your plant is not getting nutrients delivered as fast as it needs to keep up with the demand on growth.
Yep.
So now we're existing in the thrip zone, and we make an IPM spray. But this time we made a little bit more aggressive IPM spray, and we're going to drop well down into the anaerobic pest and disease zone, which leads to frustration, right?
And typically an outbreak of some sort, PM, some other pest that comes up. So that is the typical trajectory. And then people will say, well, this whole soil food web thing doesn't work.
Right.
You know what I mean? Or they just don't understand how they're getting to the level of what they're getting. You know, when we say that you should be out of pest and disease, yes, you should, but you have to have a certain level of understanding of what's happening below ground. And most people that are doing this work with us. They're actually measuring this so they can see it and they can start understanding how the biology actually affects the outcome of the plant. And so that science married with the outcome of what you're seeing of the observer starts to build that level of trust in nature.
Exactly. All right. So now let's go to our next example. So let's assume here we've got proper inoculation. We're moving into the biological minimums, leading to good, desirable plant growth. 3 days in, 7 days in, whatever, it's time to start spraying chemicals and pesticides and nonsense. Drops us way down below the biological minimums. Growth rates come to a slow. We're now operating in the thrip zone, following up with some more IPM sprays. And this time we're getting tired of thrips. So we're going to make a way more aggressive application. It drops us much lower into that anaerobic pest and disease zone. And then if you start to exist in that realm, well, now you're into a much more significant problem like russet mites. And I think this is the part that pretty much every farmer seems to miss, is that we are literally driving this system through our choices in IPM sprays, killing off all the beneficial biology. Interestingly enough, all the diseases tend to live just fine in that realm and don't seem to be killed by all the neem oils and other nonsense that we spray. And you exist here in the russet mites. Well, it doesn't always have to be an IPM spray, and I guess I could have made another slide, but let's say that we've inoculated properly. We get up into the biological minimum zone, but instead of an IPM spray, maybe we had a flooding event. So maybe we had a flooding event which will, through loss of oxygen, suffocate those oxygen-rich organisms, drop you down into this zone. Then you might choose to make an IPM spray or have another overwatering event, and you can also end up in this russet mite zones.
So russet mites is just the example for insert any mite here. Insert any sucking pest at that, at that level. So that's the trajectory, generally speaking, for all of that. We're just keeping it very simple for the purposes of this webinar. But that's the trajectory that we often see just in the general consensus that's out there, that we need to be spraying. We need to be proactive, and the intention is good. We want to be proactive. We want to be helping our plant. We want to make sure that it's not going to get inundated with pests. But we don't understand the relationship between these compounds and the below ground organisms we're trying to cultivate. The two often don't go hand in hand, and one, you have to have a certain amount of trust, and oftentimes that trust must come from, at least initially, getting the science and the lab results that then match what you're seeing in the general story of what's happening with your crop, right? We need to be able to build a foundation that we can lean into to be able to build a bridge so that we can start trusting nature. I mean, nature's been doing it. She's just waiting for you to come along with her. She's just waiting for you to get the data so that you can start leaning into her, and you can start going, you know what, I don't need the IPM spray. Maybe I need more inoculations. Maybe I need to actually use nutrition more strategically. Things like that can help just add one more layer of resiliency to this whole system, right?
I'm way off on I don't know what happened here. I apologize, but
it's all good.
This is a little less impactful than I'd like to have with the comments. But hey, man, we've been on the road. But yeah, keep bringing the facts, Sarah. Keep bringing the facts.
So we're keeping it real basic. We're really just trying to show you how this one factor, because we teach all of it, right? We teach the mineral chemistry, we teach the biology, and we also teach the nutritional complement to that. But the biology is the foundation of all of it. If you can't get this right, which often the only barrier to success in this typically is the psychology.
Yeah.
That habitual, nature that we have learned to trust, per se, of killing things. That's one way to go about it, but that means you have to constantly kill. You can never get out of killing things. You have to be killing things in order to prevent the next thing that comes in to then, that gets summoned by that event, right? Because you're making the plant weaker by doing that. You're removing the things that make it strong, which is the microorganisms. And so when you make the plant weaker, it must lean on you for those IPM sprays. You then have to become the immune system for that plant, which is a lot more work. And then the plant can't express its highest health and evolution of what it's capable of doing, right? When we make it weak and make it dependent on us, then it can't express its highest genetic potential. And that's what we're after when it comes to anything we're growing, whether it be food or cannabis. It's all medicine. Terpenes are medicine. That's what we've literally evolved over time. Our tongue, our taste buds, our intelligent organism knows what is medicine. And that's why you eat this tomato and don't eat that tomato, right? Because it tastes good, and that tells you it is good for you. And so all we're saying is learn how to retrain your brain to align with the intelligence of nature, and that might be that you need to have bioassays to then train you and facilitate that trust for you to trust nature, trust that you've got the biology there, because it goes beyond trust. Now you can start to marry what you're actually doing in the field that you understand to be correct. Is your understanding correct? Yes, my bioassays are actually showing that I'm getting into this zone. Or maybe there's something I'm doing, something that I hadn't thought of that's hindering that. This is the most typical thing that we're talking about with IPM sprays and that trajectory, because that's just in the general consensus. That's just what we've all been conditioned to do, right, is need these pesticides. But what we really need now at this moment in time is to learn to trust the intelligence of nature and use science to bridge that gap, that we can lean into nature once we understand what we're doing, once we understand everything that we are doing as a human, because our intentions are there, but we need to align our actions to get the actual results that bring about what we're talking about, right? And it's not going to be absolutely perfect the first time you try to execute this. There's going to be some learning, but you need to be willing to trust that nature is intelligent. And I'm assuming that if you're here, you do believe that. You do
I would
know
hope
that.
so.
Yeah.
It definitely helps your progress and success, for
Yes.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Miggs is having a question here. Is where's the two-spotted mite zone? So this is an extremely dynamic system, and we're oversimplifying it here to communicate a concept. But what is really consistent is just below this line of, so if this is biological minimums, this is below. Just below this biological minimums is definitely very clearly the thrip zone, and most farmers exist in this world. And if you can get up into this biological minimum zone and get out of thrips, usually that's about a 40% increase in all categories.
Even just biology alone.
Just biology
Not all the
alone.
other things we do. Just
Yeah,
biology
just
alone
biology
will
alone.
bump you up. Yeah.
Now, this below minimums and anaerobic zone is a wide gradient with a lot of different combinations, but the general concept is the same. The further down this road you get into decreased oxygen organisms, the higher the pest and disease and the more problematic they become. So russet mites would be like basically the opposite of what this blue would be. So instead of having very high levels of flagellates and amoebae, which are the oxygen aerobic environment predators of bacteria, you would have the ciliates and the anaerobic predators of bacteria in the same quantity. So it's kind of upside down land.
Right.
So if you're battling russet mites in living soil, you are on the complete opposite end of the pendulum of where that plant wants to exist. Same with root aphids, broad mites. Those are all way, 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 way down here. Two-spotted mites can have some aspects of the green and also some aspects of the red. So it's kind of a merging of you might be in the biological minimums for bacteria and fungi, but also very anaerobic. So I just put russet mites on here because they're kind of the furthest out of the.
So that sounds like they're a transition type.
Yeah, they're
you wouldn't be able to
yeah. If
You
you're in
wouldn't be able
root
to
aphids,
stay aerobic and have that much fungi
yeah,
for long.
yeah. If you're in russet mite, broad mite, root aphid land, you're a long way from biologically complete living soil. You're at the other end of the zone, and so I guess the question becomes, where do you place your trust?
In the habitual act of killing things, like we have been doing, or are we going to shift into the resilient, life-giving forces of nature?
That's the $1,000,000 question, y'all.
Right?
So what are we going to do there? And yeah, Mr. OY is correct. Creating our own problems 101. Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing here. So
That's pretty much humanity since,
yeah.
creating our own problems, learning. But hey, I think we're here to evolve. We're here to, get past that. I think we're at a precipice of either you evolve or you don't continue on.
Totally.
So, we have choices to make, and we thankfully have science to help us bridge that gap. I think we just, need to understand that, I guess in this day and age, some science has kind of been usurped and led us astray. And so we have a hard time knowing what to trust. And that's kind of the name of the game. What are we going to trust at this point in time? What can we trust? And what's been proven that we could trust? And to me, nature is without a doubt what we can trust. It's been here supporting life, loaning us life to even answer this question for eons of time.
Yeah.
So I'm going to lean into that. I've been leaning into that, and we've been, giving people lots of success in doing that and seeing the resiliency and the absolute, just incredible life-giving forces of nature in doing that. But thank God we have some science that can actually show us as a guidepost as to where we are in that trajectory when we're transitioning.
Yeah.
So I know we can get real philosophical about it, but maybe we should. Maybe we should get real philosophical about it. But more than that, marry that with actual actionable items that we can do to actually move us from one paradigm of thinking that isn't working, that keeps us in the same old, fighting and fighting and fighting bugs and fighting our minds, fighting our fears, fighting everything, to how can we transition into something that actually provides life, that gives life, that, helps us in return. So, yeah.
And once you do, it's pretty fun. So it's worth it. Sammy's asking, how about the Springtail Zone? So I would consider those a beneficial insect that just tend to show up once you start getting a certain level of even time in a soil-based system. So the springtails are just fine. I wouldn't worry about killing those. There are other little insects that look kind of like that, like symphylans, and what's the other one?
Yes, symphylans and springtails. But I think what you need to know about a lot of organisms in nature is that they kind of can fulfill many roles. So for springtails and symphylans, their preferred food source is fungi. And if you don't have that, or if they consume it all, or if it's low, then they will go after the next best food source, which is often young, tender plants. So making sure that you have enough of their food source, their preferred food source, which is the fungi, is the best way to combat them, or not combat them, to switch them into being a benefit to your garden, rather than taking over your garden in a human perception of unbeneficial ways, right? So there's a lot of things in nature that provide that role. Some fungi will do that as well. So, and that's just intelligence, right?
Could you discuss the relationship between nitrogen and the biology? Do you notice a decline in the more complex biology when nitrogen drops below 50 parts per million? So I would assume this is on like the Logan Labs test. This is something I've said in other videos, that growth rates come to a pretty grinding halt when nitrogen is below 50 parts per million. And probably the most common pattern in all soil samples that I see that come from farmers that have never done soil testing before and are stumped and perplexed is that nitrogen's below 50 parts per million. So the system in general tends to slow down pretty good, but the biology can produce their own nitrogen in the predator-prey interactions. And so it's not necessarily that you see like a biological drop-off, but plant growth comes to a pretty grinding halt. And so I would think if you get really low, you would start to see it. But what do you think?
If you're, and that's the thing, is that if your nitrogen in your soil is dropping below 50 parts per million, you'd better have really good nutrient cycling, which means you'd better have a really good foundation of bacteria and a really good foundation of the nutrient cycler. So up in those blue boxes, if possible, or at least in the high, right before the blue boxes. So that is going to give you a lot of nitrogen and can float some of that nitrogen for you when your nitrogen drops. But if it does drop below 50 parts per million, you will have to have that level of bacteria to protozoans that we're talking about and nematodes in the system. Otherwise, you will definitely come to a grinding halt. Yeah.
But then the problem becomes if nitrogen is dropping below, because we believe that there's certain mineral contents that need to belong in a soil, regardless of how much biology you put in there.
Right.
You have to have a certain mineral chemistry thing going on. And so
it's balance in all things.
Yeah, but if you have high biological activity and a mineral nutrient is starting to become deficient, and that high level of bacteria and fungi and biological system will actually accelerate that deficiency. That's why you need to maintain these things. So it's not necessarily that the biology will come to a grinding halt. The plant growth definitely does.
So the plant then stops feeding.
And so indirectly you might see a slowdown. But I think the actual issue in that type of situation is the higher the biological activity, the faster you're going to deplete deficiencies, and that they need to be addressed.
Especially in a potting soil.
Especially in a potting soil. Yeah. So, well, I wanted to thank you guys for joining us on this webinar series. We're trying to keep it short and sweet for some of our new members. We will be continuing on with more videos into the future. We'll put a link in the description, maybe not. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. But check back, like, subscribe, all that stuff. We'll be around doing this again for webinar 2. We'll let you know when that is.
Webinar 3.
Well, this is Soil Biology 1, technically, I guess. So this would be...
Whatever he said.
This is webinar 2. We're just not very good at this YouTube thing, man. But you let us know.
We're coming back at you.
We're coming back at you.
With more.
We'll maybe get some hashtags and see you on the flip side, homies.
All right.